Hello. Do you work here?
Guilty.
In season 1 of the Netflix series You, Joe Goldberg is presented as intelligent, charming, and introspective. However, beneath the surface, he is a stalker, a murderer, and someone with a deep need for control. Joe is not a typical villain. Instead, he is a morally complex character. In this video, I will analyze Joe throughout season 1, focusing on his relationship with Beck and the key scenes that reveal his psychology. Joe forms deeply obsessive attachments. He does not truly fall in love with people. Instead, he falls in love with the idea of them, the fantasy he creates in his own mind. Rather than allowing relationships to develop naturally, he invades people's privacy, uncovers every detail of their lives, and convinces himself that this gives him a deeper understanding of them. This is shown most clearly through his obsession with Beck. Joe and Beck first meet in a bookstore. This scene is important because it establishes the central contradiction of Joe's character. On the surface, he appears to be an ordinary man, intelligent, charming, and thoughtful. However, through his internal monologue, the audience is immediately shown the distorted thinking that makes him dangerous. Without Joe's narration, the scene would seem completely normal. A young woman enters a bookstore and starts a conversation with a friendly employee who shares her love of literature. However, the audience hears Joe's internal thoughts. While Beck is simply having a pleasant conversation, Joe is already creating a fantasy around her and forming an idealized version of someone he has only known for a few minutes. One of Joe's defining traits is his ability to observe people closely. When Beck enters the shop, he analyzes every detail about her: the clothes she wears, the books she chooses, and the way she behaves. From these observations, he immediately creates assumptions about who she is, convincing himself that she chose a certain book because she's intelligent, or wears certain accessories because she wants to be noticed. Joe's biggest flaw is that he does not observe reality objectively. Instead, he interprets reality in a way that supports the story he wants to believe. And this further shows that Joe does not truly love Beck for who she is. Instead, he becomes attached to the version of Beck that he has created in his mind. He does not allow her to reveal herself naturally. He fills in the gaps with his own assumptions and fantasies, confusing his imagination with genuine understanding. Throughout the series, Joe's narration presents him as observant, thoughtful, and misunderstood, allowing him to see himself as the hero of his own story. What makes his narration so interesting is not that he's unreliable because he is deliberately trying to deceive the audience. Instead, he genuinely believes he's a good person, despite the horrific things he does. He is not lying to us, he is lying to himself. Joe's central psychological conflict is his desperate need to see himself as a good person, even as a savior. If he were to acknowledge the reality of his behavior, his entire identity would fall apart. This becomes a coping mechanism. Joe judges himself based on his intentions rather than his actions, believing that having good intentions makes his behavior morally acceptable. When he kills someone, he convinces himself that he is doing it to protect another person. In the same way, when he stalks Beck, he believes he is keeping her safe. However, Joe's moral reasoning is deeply hypocritical, because he only applies this logic to himself. When other characters behave harmfully, he does not offer them the same understanding or justification. Another contradiction within Joe's personality is that he is both highly perceptive and completely unaware of his own psychological flaws. He quickly notices dishonesty, manipulation, and selfishness in other people, yet he fails to recognize these same traits within himself. It is as though he exists inside a psychological bubble, constantly protecting the idealized version of himself that he has created. More than anything, Joe is committed to preserving the story he tells himself about who he is. Joe is not a traditional villain because he is not portrayed as someone who lacks all emotion or empathy. He experiences guilt and remorse, which he interprets as proof that he is fundamentally a good person. However, he fails to understand that feeling guilty does not undo the harm caused by his own actions. His guilt often becomes another way of protecting his self-image, rather than taking genuine responsibility. Joe appears to have two different identities. There is the version of himself that he presents to the world, caring, romantic, intelligent, and thoughtful. Beneath that is the obsessive, controlling, and violent side of him. Instead of accepting that both sides exist within the same person, Joe separates them. He cannot accept the reality of who he is because it would force him to confront the contradiction between his self-image and his actions. Joe desperately wants love and intimacy and presents himself as a hopeless romantic. However, he is always the one that destroys his relationships, because instead of trusting Beck, he tries to control her. Their relationship is built on an illusion, because Joe never allows Beck to see who he truly is or what his real intentions are. Ironically, his fear of losing love is exactly what prevents him from ever experiencing genuine love. At times, the audience may even sympathise with Joe, because his narration reveals something deeply human. Everyone creates stories about themselves. People create narratives that protect their self-esteem and justify their choices, and preserve their sense of identity. Joe does the same thing, but to an extreme and dangerous degree. His self-deception is what makes him so destructive. Throughout the series, flashbacks to Joe's childhood reveal how deeply his early experiences shaped his psychology. As children, we learn relationships from the people around us. Joe's mother was abused by his father, and in an attempt to protect her, Joe shoots and kills his father. Afterwards, he is sent to an orphanage, where he experiences neglect and bullying. These experiences teach him that love is connected with violence, fear, and control. The adults who are supposed to provide Joe with safety instead become the source of his trauma. As a child, he was unable to recognize that these relationships were unhealthy, causing him to develop the belief that love and violence naturally exist together. This belief also allows him to psychologically justify killing his father and protect himself from the overwhelming guilt. This distorted understanding of love is reflected in Joe's relationship with Beck. He believes that protecting the person he loves means removing anyone he sees as a threat, which is demonstrated when he murders Benji. Violence has become his version of love. Because Joe never experienced genuine safety as a child, his adulthood is defined by an overwhelming need for control. He is constantly analysing who Beck is speaking to, what she might be hiding, and what could happen next. This hyper-awareness may have helped him survive in his traumatic childhood, but as an adult it becomes destructive and unhealthy. This can be interpreted through Freud's concept of repetition compulsion, the idea that unresolved trauma can cause people to unconsciously recreate aspects of their past. Joe repeats the psychological patterns established in childhood by becoming the kind of controlling and violent figure that harmed him. Although he believes his actions are motivated by love and protection, he is actually repeating the same cycles of fear, control, and violence that shaped him. So ultimately, Joe's internal conflict exists between two versions of himself: the frightened child who longs for love, safety, and acceptance, and the psychologically distorted adult who believes that violence, control, and obsession are the only ways to achieve these things. The tragedy of Joe Goldberg is not simply that he is violent, but it's that he genuinely cannot separate love from possession, making authentic love impossible. There's a deep irony at the centre of Joe's character. He hates being misunderstood, yet he never makes any effort to truly understand others. He believes that by collecting every detail about Beck, her habits, her past insecurities, he has gained a complete understanding of who she is. However, he never fully accepts her as a fully independent person with her own desires, flaws, and identity beyond his perception of her. To Joe, knowing information about someone is the same as knowing them. But he is only ever in love with the version of Beck that exists within his own imagination. We can see that Joe Goldberg is a morally complex character. He is not the typical villain. He's not a cold-blooded murderer that has no empathy. But he is a character that is very broken and has been shaped by the deep trauma in his childhood. This was my analysis of Joe Goldberg in Season 1. I hope you enjoyed.